Right, I don't know if anyone remembers the great heat wave of 2018. It was a big one, and I was living in London at the time, and as many of you know, London can become quite oppressively hot when there's a heat wave, and you just don't want to go outside. I had to go to the supermarket, so I went out in the morning, and by the time I came back, it was already sweltering in the late morning. And as I approached my building, I encountered someone staggering towards me who was clearly already drunk, and by the look of him, had already been in a fight. In fact, I surmised that he'd been in a fight with one or more Romanians because he looked up at me and said, "Are you Romanian?" I said, "No." And he said, "You better not be." Immediately I thought, I shouldn't have said that. I should have said, "What if I am Romanian? Have you got a problem with that?" But I didn't think of that in time. I did, though, worry about someone who might be approaching from behind. So I looked around to see who might be coming next and might face the same challenge in case there was a Romanian who needed my assistance. And there wasn't. There was someone coming, but it was a black guy. And I thought, he almost certainly isn't Romanian. I mean, it's possible, but really unlikely. But then if this guy hates Romanians, maybe he's generally racist, or have we got past that as a society? Anyway, I watched as he staggered past this black guy, no interest at all in challenging him. Obviously didn't think he was Romanian. And I thought of that as I was preparing for today, because it occurs to me there's certain nationalities that are very much associated with particular ethnicities or races. When you watch the World Cup, you know that the Romanian team are going to look pretty much alike. And other teams are going to look, the English, the French, the Dutch, they're going to be much more diverse, different colours, shapes and sizes, maybe not so much. So I've always thought of it, tend to think of England as being quite a multi-ethnic country or nation. But it gets complicated, and not everyone sees it that way. Many of you will have come across the viral clip last year or before this year, of Constantine Kissin and Fraser Nelson talking. Constantine Kissin, who does the trigonometry podcast that we talked about, and Fraser Nelson was, I think, at the time, the editor of The Spectator. And over the course of the conversation, Nelson described Rishi Sunak as being something like one of the most English people I know. And Kissin says, "How is Rishi Sunak English? He's a brown Hindu." And I think Nelson was a bit shocked by this, but he had a conversation where it became clear that Kissin considers English to be an ethnicity, whereas Nelson had a different view. I mean, it helps to know who these two people are. It helps to know that Nelson is Scottish, so when he says someone is English, it's not necessarily a compliment, although in this case, it did seem to be quite affectionate. He was saying, I recognise in Rishi Sunak some of the qualities I see in my English friends. Kissin is not English. I think he's a Russian immigrant. I think he's lived in Scotland as well as England, but clearly doesn't identify with either as much as he does with Britain. And I know where he's coming from. As long as I can remember, there's been an idea that Britishness is a kind of broader ethnic identity. So immigrants and their descendants might not feel English or Scottish, but they can be British. It's often presented as quite an inclusive thing, that don't worry about not being English, you can be British. And many black and brown people in Britain go along with that. I think Suella Braverman was famously said that she doesn't consider herself English. The thing is, there's always been others who do consider themselves English, or identify more as English than British. So I think if we're talking about new language, it's important to recognise people use the same words in different ways. No one's saying Rishi Sunak is ethnically English, but maybe it's more important just to be culturally English. People weigh these things up slightly differently. So I think that's an important qualification. And again, coming back to the England football team, it's a bit weird to say that half the England football team is not English. And even weirder to say it's all right because they're British. What's that got to do with the England football team? So the taxonomy of British entities that was adopted by Kissin and many others, I think is too crude and sweeping, but it does highlight an important distinction. Because Kissin didn't question Sunak's political citizenship as a Briton, or his suitability as an Indian Briton to be Prime Minister. And of course, if you take Aristotle's understanding of what a citizen is, Sunak is undoubtedly a citizen, probably more than most. As Prime Minister and still as an MP, he's a statesman devoted to public service. He might not be that good at it, but I don't think he's in it for the money. So he's definitely a citizen, and there's no such thing as an English citizen or a Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish citizen. To be a citizen of this country is to be a British one. And some people would insist that we're not citizens, we're subjects of the crown, but for the purposes of this discussion, I don't think it matters. The point is not that you can be a full citizen in a political sense without being native. That's true of all countries that naturalise migrants. It's that British citizenship is or can become one step removed from most people's primary identity. Now, people might disagree, but the sense I've always had is that most English people think of themselves as English first, and British not so much secondly as implicitly. To be English is to be British. It's just really straightforward. And I think, for many Scots, like me, feel the same, but there's a sizable minority in Scotland that insists on being Scottish and not British. And that means that the British identity is much more explicit and contested in Scotland, as well as Wales, and especially in Northern Ireland. But this politicisation of Britishness obscures the fact that it remains a cultural reality, I think, and not merely a bureaucratic category, as it might sometimes seem. And there's a million examples of that, but just think of James Bond. There's this great scene in You Only Live Twice when Sean Connery's 007 mutters, "The things I do for England." And his Scottish accent is not supposed to be funny or ironic. The joke in this scene is that his patriotic self-sacrifice is that he's undressing a beautiful woman. You're not supposed to notice his accent, or if you do, it's England, Britain, whatever. People seem to worry less about those things in the 60s. And unlike Americans, British people never talk about a British accent, but we certainly notice the difference between the various accents that are British and those that are not. And we recognize other subtle cues that indicate someone is or isn't British. So that kind of Britishness is one that I share with Rishi Sunak and with Mo and with many of you. And it's different from the Britishness we all share with an Indian or indeed a Romanian who's just become a British citizen. They have the same political and civil rights, but obviously not the same depth as belonging as people who've grown up in this country. And how could they? I don't think it's necessarily a problem. Nonetheless, the use of Britishness as a catch-all, ethnically neutral category aligned with citizenship rather than belonging does tend to widen the gap between the two. What's often disparaged as English nationalism is probably better understood as a reaction against this hollowing out of national identity under the label of Britishness. Now, I confess I'm not on TikTok, but I read in the London Review of Books that there's a worrying phenomenon spilling out from that platform known as UK, Y-O-O-K-A-Y. And it's a way that people mock the grim aesthetics of rundown multicultural Britain in a way that sometimes veers into racism. I think maybe it comes from the same kind of feeling, a frustration with this. What is this UK? It's not a real country. And it's important to emphasize this gap that I'm talking about between citizenship and belonging is not about a distinction between the political and the cultural. Citizenship is both political and cultural. But culture as a feature of citizenship tends to be downplayed or disparaged in modern liberal accounts, especially if it's got an ethnic dimension. That's despite the fact that it's more or less taken for granted in Aristotle's Politics. Even when there's sections where he talks about what qualifies someone to be citizen of a particular city, but overall, we're always talking about Greeks. That identity is assumed. So, to frame our understanding in terms of belonging, I'm going to draw on a different ancient source, the Apostle Paul. Now, the Bible tells us that Paul had no fewer than 3 distinct citizenships. When he's arrested while preaching in Jerusalem, he's accused of being an Egyptian terrorist, effectively. And he protests, no, he's a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, and thus a citizen of no mean city. And we can detect some civic pride in his hometown. But when he's threatened with flogging, he points out he's also a Roman citizen. Now, at this stage, Paul had never actually been to Rome. It's unlikely he had any Latin, and he certainly didn't follow the Roman religion. So, in what sense he was a Roman citizen? Well, it's a legal privilege that he inherited from his father, who probably bought it. But so to speak, it's a useful passport to have because it meant he couldn't be mistreated. Finally, though, writing to the church in the Roman colony of Philippi, he reminds his fellow Christians that as much as they might benefit from Roman citizenship, ultimately our citizenship is in heaven. That is, they share an identity with other Christians that is not of this world, echoing Paul's famous remark elsewhere that there is neither Greek nor Jew in Christ. So I think this captures 3 different ways of thinking about citizenship, each of which has more to do with belonging and politics. We could think of these in terms of membership, different types of membership. Natal citizenship is like membership of a family, clan, or tribe. It's implicit and almost irrevocable. Then what you might call passport citizenship is more transactional, and it's mostly about benefits, membership of a business association, or even a library or gym. Finally, credo citizenship, which includes membership of a community united by a belief or idea. That could be a church or, a revolutionary party. Rather than benefits, the emphasis is on duty or responsibility to some transcendent goal shared with other members. Now, all 3 forms of membership can and do apply to citizenship. It's not that one or 2 are right and the other is wrong, but I think they have to be balanced, and that's the crucial thing, what kind of balance they have. So, starting with native, I don't suppose I have to labour the trouble with an excessively nativist view of citizenship. Most countries have a degree of internal diversity, ethnic, religious, geographical, and that's whether or not they also have inward migration. So an excessively narrow conception of who really belongs can lead to exclusion and persecution of minorities. Despite that, most successful polities do have a clear national character. And by that, I don't mean stereotypical dress and cuisine and mannerisms. I'm not doing any more impressions. I mean the simple fact that citizens identify with their country without having to think about it. They have a sense of belonging based on birth and upbringing rather than official status or adherence to an idea, a creed. In that sense, a nation is more akin to a family than a party. In many respects, families are pretty much alike. To belong to one family rather than another is not necessarily to conform to a unique set of family characteristics. And you don't love your family because it's better than anyone else's. You're pretty much stuck with it. That's not to say that nations or families don't have shared values or beliefs. But a family with a mission statement is a family to run away from. So that brings me to Roger Scruton's book, England Analogy, which is a very explicit expression of the love of country, the kind of thing Frank was talking about yesterday, which is much even less fashionable now than it was when the book came out in 2000, I think. So he expresses the love of England, even if he can only do it in the past tense because he thinks it's dead, effectively. But it's not a work of social science. It's not primarily trying to analyze England in terms of what makes it different from any other country. As an elegy, it calls to mind David Brooks's distinction between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. I don't know if people have come across this. The idea is that when you die, you don't want someone to stand up at your funeral and list your career achievements. You want them to talk about what you meant to the people you love and who loved you. That's the kind of book this is, I think, more so than anything else. So in cool objective terms, it might not be all that different from what's said at any other funeral. And that's not because you're not special, but because what makes you special is not subject to forensic analysis. For the same reason, a eulogy is also going to be personal, reflecting the particular experience of the person giving it. The same is very much true of Scruton's Elegy for England. It unashamedly reflects his class background, his generation, his personality. At one point, he seems to concede, that the particular English character he's describing didn't emerge until the 20th century. So it's very kind of ephemeral what he's getting at there. Nevertheless, the character is a product of England. England is a country with a particular geography and history. It's telling that Scruton says England is a country rather than a nation. There's a sense that nations are frightfully European things, but Scruton's England is neither an ethnic nor a political community, but an enchanted isle. If you haven't read it, read it, then you'll believe me. I say isle, but it's striking how little love there is in the book for Britain or the British. There's the occasional grudging acknowledgement that other parts of Britain might have some of the finer features of England while obviously falling short in others. But for him, it seems that Britain is closer to being that kind of passport identity than a real country. Interestingly, around the same time as that book, Peter Hitchens wrote a similarly pessimistic book, but he called his The Abolition of Britain. I wonder if his choice of Britain reflects the fact that he comes from a naval family, and the military is one institution that really has a strong sense of Britishness. But again, it's just underlining the idea that English-British is quite a subjective thing, how people interpret these things and what they identify with. After actually the only vaguely optimistic thing Hitchens has written since that is a stroppy column calling for England to leave the UK. But I would argue that Britain and England remain as entangled in death as they were in life. And it's important to note that their purported demise has little to do with immigration. Hitchens sees immigration as a symptom of decline, not its cause. And Scruton mentions it only to illustrate that deracinated catch-all sense of Britishness as distinct from Englishness that I've already discussed. When it comes to pointing fingers, Scruton is much angrier about the Local Government Act of 1888. Again, you have to read the book. So it's unfortunate that the debates about citizenship only tend to come up in the context of immigration, but those debates can still shed light on things. So we heard again yesterday about Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers speech. And it was kind of ridiculous that he was condemned mostly for saying things that were reasonable, but if not convincing coming from him. I do think the phrase Island of Strangers was slightly unfortunate because some of the critics pointed out, well, any modern society, it's not a medieval village, of course we're surrounded by strangers. There are strangers and strangers, but I'll come back to that. Part of what Scruton loved about England was the aloofness of its people. So here's an interesting quotation. English society was a society of strangers who kept each other at a distance while acknowledging each other's right to belong. Strangers do not live together by affection, by family sentiment, by swearing bonds of blood brotherhood in the manner of the Arabian tribes. They live together by law, convention, and a silent appeal to precedent. I think that's a good description, not just of England, but of a certain kind of modernity. But maybe it's a form of modern civilization that England has bequeathed to much of the modern world, at least partly. England is partly responsible for that. One of the foreign writers of England that Scruton quotes approvingly is Nirad Chowdhury. Again, if you've read the book, you might remember he's the one who's astonished to discover that the default status of English people in public or private is silence. Maybe that England really is dead. But Chowdhury is best known, ironically, for his autobiography of an unknown Indian, which is a really fascinating book about growing up. He was born at the end of the 19th century and lived through the independence movement and independence itself. The book was published in 1951, and it had a very remarkable dedication. It was dedicated, quote, to the memory of the British Empire in India, which conferred subjecthood upon us, but withheld citizenship, to which yet every one of us threw out the challenge, Civus Britannicus sum, I am a British citizen, because all that was good and living within us was made, shaped, and quickened by the same British rule. As you can imagine, that dedication was not universally popular. In fact, when the book was reissued in 1999, its British publisher, Picador, omitted it, we think without his knowledge. And you might think it's an embarrassing kind of colonial cringe, but Chowdhury was no toady. As his Latin indicates, he was aware that much of the best of Britain was itself an inheritance from the classical world, as I'm sure even Scruton would have acknowledged. The dedication also highlights the fact that in the case of the British Empire, the distinction between citizens and subjects really does matter. It was a more one-sided kind of belonging. Indians belonged to the British Empire, but the British Empire did not belong to them. And yet, clearly, some Indians did feel an affinity with the mother country. Chowdhury opens his autobiography with chapters on the places that formed him as a child. The Bengali town where he was born and grew up, the ancestral village of his father, the village of his mother, both of which he visited a lot, and finally England, which he never visited, but which had a powerful hold on his imagination. I suppose empire will do that. As mere subjects of the empire, Indians in the Raj experienced different kinds of belonging. Chowdhury describes the difference between his life in his ancestral village, where his family dominated and could order their inferiors about, and in the town, where their social peers were not relatives, and shockingly, workers and servants had to be paid. And he said about this, I suppose on this score, our urban relationships could be called social as distinct from tribal. Social as distinct from tribal, and economic as distinct from feudal. More than that, and remembering a Scruton description of England, I'll read a series of short quotations. At Kisharganj, that's the town, we felt there was a tie which was not created by the mere friendliness of a number of people towards one another, nor by their having to pay one another, but by some cohesive power belonging to the town in the abstract and exerting its influence on everyone who came to live in it. The town was the town in its own right, claimed loyalty in its own right, and made people feel drawn to one another on account of their common membership of the town. It must have been a feeling of this kind which lay at the root of the Greek loyalty to the polis. It was created and at the same time rested on a new awareness, the political. I don't know whether this new awareness and the social conditions that gave rise to it were the result of British rule or would have emerged anyway. But looking back, we know that Indian political consciousness would soon be mobilized against British rule, with at least some Indian thinkers drawing on that same classical inheritance to make the case for self-rule. At Kisharganj, though, the sense of belonging described by Chowdhury was more pre-political than properly political. The town's polis excluded most of the population and was really an association of middle-class professionals. Even those full citizens of the town remained subject to the Raj. They did not govern themselves. Not that it mattered, because as Chowdhury puts it, the citizen's life at that time was overwhelmingly the pursuit of personal prosperity. The tensions between citizenship and subjection, and between public and private concerns, are not new, and they underpin the second kind of belonging I've described, one that's not given by birth, but more transactional in character. It's kind of tempting to see this as a degeneration of true citizenship. But in the case of India, political citizenship had its origins in this pre-political sense of belonging that grew up in the shelter of the Raj. And I wonder, isn't something similar true of medieval Europe, where guilds and similar associations laid the foundations of liberal capitalism and ultimately democracy, even as lords and kings held on to political power? The history is very different, but there's a definite rhyme with the progress from pre-political associations to political parties. Interestingly, though, classically the transition goes the other way, these different kinds of belonging. A distinction has long been made between politically active citizenship on the model of the ancient Greek city-states, like those discussed by Aristotle, as well as the Roman Republic, and then a more passive, legalistic kind of citizenship associated with the Roman Empire. Paul the Apostle might have been a Roman citizen and benefited from the protection of the Roman law, but he certainly would not have voted or otherwise had any say in the running of the empire. It was a passport citizenship. Looking to modern citizenship, of course, it's different and it embraces whole populations rather than a slave-owning elite in the case of the ancient republics, or even a slave-owning elite supplemented by freed slaves, foreigners, and anyone else who could pay for the privilege in the case of the Roman Empire. But the same tension exists between the idea of a politically active citizenship and a more passive transactional version. I'm sure you're all familiar with versions of this debate. In fact, it could be, and it has been argued, that mass democracy lends itself more readily to the latter, to a more passive type of citizenship. Nevertheless, mass active democracy has also had its moments, as you all know. Historically, large numbers have joined political parties and engaged in social movements, as well as voting. If there's a tendency towards passivity today, or there has been over the past generation, couple of generations, it's less to do with the logistics of mass democracy than the disillusionment of the masses with politics and the politics with the masses. You can see where this is going. It's nowhere better exemplified than in the European Union. The EU embodies a particular model of citizenship that applies not only to the EU itself, but also within its member states. And that has nothing to do with active participation in politics. The EU is suspicious of or hostile to national sovereignty, adding citizens' aspirations to self-rule. In a sense, the model EU citizen is not even a resident in his or her home nation. He or she enjoys freedom of movement far too much to be pinned down. Certainly, if you remember during the Brexit referendum, a lot was made of the contribution by EU citizens in Britain, how hard they worked, how much tax they paid, and so on. But I mean, I don't begrudge EU citizens in Britain for not being all that interested in British domestic politics, especially before Brexit. But it is a strange kind of model citizen who doesn't even vote. So I think it's a good model for that passivity. Then, if you remember, bringing back memories, after the referendum, the concept was floated to something called EU citizenship for Remain voting Britons who've been left heartbroken by the result. Do people remember this? Yeah. And to be fair, some actually took the blunder and moved to EU countries, the EU country of their choice, and maybe, for all I know, maybe they became good Portuguese and German citizens. Thousands more applied for Irish citizenship, partly for convenience and partly just to get the personal satisfaction of sticking it to Brexit. Fair enough, whatever turns you on. But this putative EU citizenship was something else. It was a bit like the generic Britishness I discussed earlier, reflecting a desire to sit in the tree without putting your weight on any particular branch. But at least there is such a thing as a British state. You can pay taxes to it, you can fight in its army, you can vote in its elections. You can't do any of those things with the EU except through one of its member states. So generic EU citizenship, of course, came to nothing. But even if it had happened, it could never have been anything more than a glorified work permit. You know, fundamentally be less like citizenship of a political community than membership of a golf club. You know, you pay your dues and you enjoy the benefits. As it happens, I wouldn't be against that in principle if people wanted to have that, but it's nothing to do with citizenship. To an extent, that kind of membership is a legitimate and necessary aspect of genuine national citizenship. The state provides certain services and grants certain privileges to those in its care. But, as the name suggests, national citizenship is based on a NATO sense of belonging, even if it's in practice not limited to those who share that kind of belonging. That means the quid pro quo is less stark. Even if you're not a particularly good citizen, you still enjoy the benefits of belonging. The state collects rubbish, provides education, and guarantees national defense, not because there's a market for those things, but because it has a duty to its people. And if you don't pay your taxes, you can be imprisoned. But the state doesn't, for that reason, leave your rubbish uncollected, expel your children from school, or let the Russians invade your house. Moreover, while a golf club will kick out members who break the rules, the state cannot deport its own citizens even when they break the law. I was just discussing this with some people in the break, so it might come up. All this is to say that even the transactional aspects of citizenship are not merely transactional. They depend on a kind of belonging, whether acquired through birth or naturalization, and I think also implicitly including a culture rather than merely legal sense. And when that belonging is absent, the implicit contract is broken. I mentioned earlier that there are strangers and strangers, and there's clearly a difference between a fellow citizen, however aloof in the Scruton sense and however different in terms of ethnicity, and someone who lives in a country with no regard for its laws, customs, or expectations. I think that's common sense, to use Frank's term from yesterday, but just as clearly not everyone is happy with this qualification. The logic of human rights law is to extend the same rights and privileges to everyone, regardless not only of birth, but even of legal status and compliance with basic obligations. The idea that no one is illegal, the idea that deporting foreign nationals who break the law is a violation of human rights. The abstraction of the human and human rights from the very moral and social ties that make us human, I think is deeply ironic. There's also an irony in the Windrush scandal. I hope you all remember what that refers to, because I haven't got time to explain it. Although it was grabbed on by campaigners who oppose any deportations, the wider response actually showed most of us continue to make a moral distinction between those who belong and those who don't, or who at least don't yet. What made it a scandal was that people who had every right to consider themselves British nationals were treated as foreign nationals. Regardless of the paperwork, again, I think this is obvious, but you can disagree if you want, bring it up in the discussion. Regardless of paperwork, someone who came to Britain legally from a Commonwealth nation and has lived here for decades belongs to Britain in a way that someone who's just stepped off a plane from Lithuania does not. So, moving on to the last kind of belonging. The USA is perhaps unique in celebrating or mythologizing the idea that you can come from anywhere in the world and just become an American. Of course, my brother's done this, and it takes time and money, and it's a pain. But and also there's the fact that most Americans, or lots of Americans, question the Americanness even of legal migrants. The fact that you have a passport doesn't mean that you're accepted by everyone. But the point I want to make is even the myth of is more complicated. It's often said that USA is a creedal nation based on truth, justice, and the American way. But I think it's overstated. Americans don't have a single ethnicity, that's true. But there's clearly a distinct American identity that historically was forged from the culture and religion of the particular groups that founded the nation, above all the British. But the American creed is not Protestantism in any of its British varieties. The founders also brought from Europe the cultural memory of 2 centuries of religious conflict and were determined not to import it into the New World. So the American creed is in a sense anti-creedal. Its focus on liberty, including religious liberty, means there's a minimalism about it. Having pledged allegiance to the flag and the republic for which it stands, everyone has the right to pursue happiness in his or her own way. But it's a minimalism born of a particular religious tradition. If not Puritanism or Episcopalianism, then Christianity more generally. When Paul told the Philippians their true citizenship was in heaven, he didn't mean they should turn their backs on Rome. As John Milbank said yesterday, Christianity is uniquely compatible with a kind of dual citizenship, one for the political sphere and another for the spiritual. It's easy to forget, and again, I'm assorting this, so it may be open to discussion, but the freedom of the former, of political citizenship, emerged from the particularity of the latter, of that religious tradition, and history, actually. Other religions do not, in theory, lend themselves so readily to dual citizenship. Although it has to be noticed that in practice, people of all religions and none have flourished in America. Liberalism took on a life of its own, which is clearly not dependent on people remaining Christian. On that note, in 1790, George Washington famously visited the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island and followed up with a famous letter, which read in part, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. Now, 1 year earlier in revolutionary France, the Estates General had debated how their constitution should treat minorities. And although we tend to think of the French Revolution as being quite anti-clerical, but that came a bit later. Early on, it was still taken for granted that France was a Catholic country. And for a long time, Protestants have been excluded in various ways. And there were particular questions about Jews who were considered unsociable because they didn't mix. They had dietary rules about eating with and Gentiles, and certainly didn't intermarry. So in a famous speech, the magnificently named Count Stanislas Marie Adelaide de Clermont-Tonnerre made the case for complete religious freedom. with an important qualification. In response to concerns that the Jews comprised a nation of their own within the French nation, he said, "We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and accord everything to Jews as individuals. They should not be allowed to form in the state either a political body or an order. They must be citizens individually." Again, this is a fascinating quotation to discuss. I mean, you kind of think, is that liberal common sense or is it proto-fascism? I'm not sure if one or the other. But clearly the fear was that there's dual citizenship and dual citizenship. A spiritual rival citizenship is one thing, a political one quite another. But we have to ask, were the Jews really a political threat to the French state? You know, earlier in Britain, 16th and 17th century Britain, there was a great worry that Catholics were a threat to the state because they owed allegiance to a foreign power, to the Pope in Rome, and affected them to the military might of Spain. And in some cases that was true. There were actually plots to overthrow the regime. I don't think you could say that about the Jews in France in the 18th century. George Washington's more liberal approach to the Jews reflected both a more realistic assessment of what the Jews represented and the more minimalist nature of the American creed. Constitutionally, people were indeed citizens as individuals, but if they also chose to form associations based on religion or ethnicity, that was their business. Clermont-Tonnerre's comments on the Jews may have been a concession to entrenched anti-Semitism in France, but they also reflected the more maximalist nature of the French Revolutionary Creed, which, not in his hands but in others, eventually culminated in the official cult of reason being set up to replace Christianity altogether. I hope it's clear then that creedal citizenship of the three sounds the nicest one, but it's not necessarily benign. It can be exclusive and oppressive as the natal kind. Now, yesterday, Alan mentioned the anti-revolutionary Joseph de Maistre and his famous assertion, "There is no such thing as man in the world. In my lifetime, I have seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, etc. But as for man, I declare that I have never in my life met him. If he exists, he is unknown to me." Now, maybe this is controversial, but I want to argue that de Maistre was right. The context was his critique of the French Constitution of 1795, which had been written with this abstract hypothetical man in mind, and not the actual French people. De Maistre argued that a genuine constitution would consider the population, the mores, the religion, the geographic situation, the political circumstances, the wealth, the good and bad qualities of a particular nation to find the laws that suit it. Again, it sounds like common sense. As I've noted, many nations are more alike than we sometimes think, but the similarities should be observed and not assumed. Almost finished. Many of you have read Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's an interesting part of that where she talks about how racism could spell doom for Western civilization, but not because people retreat into nationalism, but because nations dissolve into races. Quote, when Englishmen have turned into white men, as already for a disastrous spell all Germans became Aryans, then this change will itself signify the end of Western man. The point is that nations and countries are real, or at least most of them are. Race is an abstraction. You can actively belong to a nation or country in a way that you cannot belong to a race, even the human race. The mistake of the cult of reason and similar ideologies is to make a creed out of thin air and expect people to belong to it. Some might say that's very French, ironically. The French Republican ultimately succeeded by reconciling the idealism of the revolution with the actual needs and desires of the French people. And the result was a civilization with much to admire. It was also a recognizable form of Western civilization with features that would have been recognized by Aristotle, not least citizenship. So finally, I would argue that what brings us together as citizens is nothing so abstract as our common humanity. Our citizenship is comprised of interweaving strands, as I've discussed, common heritage, common rights and responsibilities, and common beliefs. The weight given to each of these varies over time and between places. But if there is such a thing as universal humanity, and I think there is, it emerges not from biology or from abstract ideas, but from participation in civilized life, which means being a citizen of a particular polis.